My mother-in-law booked herself on our honeymoon cruise because she deserves a vacation too. She didn't know I upgraded us and canceled her reservation. My mother-in-law Diane announced at our wedding reception that she'd booked herself on our honeymoon cruise because she needed a vacation after all the stress of planning her son's wedding, even though she didn't plan anything. My husband Brett and I had saved for 2 years for this Alaskan cruise. 10 days, balcony suite, every excursion planned and paid for. We'd shown Diane the brochure months ago when she asked where we were going. Big mistake. I've always wanted to see Alaska, she'd said then. We smiled and changed the subject. During the reception, right after the father-daughter dance, Diane clinked her glass and stood up. I have an announcement, she said. Since Brett and Amy are going on that beautiful Alaskan cruise, and I've been so stressed from all this wedding planning, I've decided to treat myself. I booked a cabin on the same ship. We can all vacation together. The room went silent. Brett's face turned white. I felt my smile freeze on my face. Mom, it's our honeymoon, Brett said quietly. Oh, I know. Don't worry. I got a different deck. You'll hardly know I'm there, except for dinners and the excursions. I booked all the same ones you did so we could experience them together. She'd called the cruise line, pretended to be me, got our entire itinerary. Glacier tours, whale watching, everything. This is inappropriate, I said. Nonsense. Lots of families vacation together. Plus, someone needs to make sure you two actually see the sights instead of just staying in your cabin the whole time. She winked at the crowd. Brett's father tried to intervene. Diane, let the kids have their trip. I am. I'm just taking my own trip at the same time. On the same boat. It's a big ship. The next 2 weeks were a nightmare of Diane texting constantly about her packing, her excitement, her plans for family dinners every night. Brett tried talking to her. She cried about how he was abandoning her, how she'd been so lonely since the divorce 5 years ago, how this was her chance to finally have a vacation. I spent my whole life taking care of you, she told him. Now you begrudge me one little trip? One little trip. On our honeymoon. The night before we left, she called to confirm we were all on the same shuttle to the port. I figured we'd save money sharing, she said. Plus, we can sit together on the plane. We hadn't told her our flight information, but somehow she was on the same flight. Same row, middle seat between us. I switched with a nice man, she explained at the airport. Said I needed to sit with my family. The flight to Seattle was 5 hours of Diane talking nonstop about her last cruise 15 years ago with Brett's father. How romantic it was. How they'd renewed their vows on the ship. How this trip would help her heal from the divorce he caused by leaving her for that younger woman. She's only 45, Diane kept saying. Can you imagine? I'm 58. That's barely 13 years difference. Might as well be a child. Brett's father left because Diane was controlling, demanding, and exhausting. But we couldn't say that at 30,000 feet with her between us. We got to the port and Diane had matching shirts made. Cruising with the newlyweds, with our wedding photo on front. She was wearing hers. Had 2 more in her bag for us. For embarkation photos, she said. Won't that be cute? We refused. She pouted. Got on the ship and she'd somehow gotten herself upgraded to a balcony room on our deck. The nice man at customer service helped when I explained the situation, she said. What situation? That she'd crashed her son's honeymoon? She knocked on our door an hour after sail away. Dinner's at 6. I made reservations at the steakhouse. My treat. We had reservations at the adult-only restaurant. Had to cancel them because Diane had already told the waiter it was our honeymoon and ordered champagne. The first port day, we tried to sneak off the ship early. Diane was already at the gangway. I knew you'd try to leave without me. Good thing I'm an early riser. She talked through the entire glacier tour. The guide actually asked her to quiet down so others could hear. She pretended to zip her lips, then started again 5 minutes later. Brett loved glaciers as a child, she told everyone. I bought him so many books about them. Brett had never mentioned liking glaciers. The whale-watching trip was worse. She got seasick but refused to go inside. Threw up over the rail while talking about Brett's childhood fear of deep water. She tried to join us for our couple's massage. Actually argued with the spa receptionist that family should be together for everything. They had to call security to remove her. That night at dinner, she cried about being excluded. I just wanted to relax with my family. She sobbed loud enough for 5 tables to hear. Why are you being so cruel? Day 4, I'd had enough. While Diane was at breakfast, I went to guest services. Explained the situation. The woman behind the desk looked horrified. She crashed your honeymoon? She invited herself. We need help. Turns out there was a solution. Victor pulled up something on his computer and his professional smile faded into actual concern. He clicked between screens, comparing dates and notes, then excused himself to talk with his supervisor about our options. I sat in the guest services office watching other passengers come and go with normal cruise problems like dinner reservations and excursion questions while I waited to see if they could help us escape my mother-in-law. Victor came back 15 minutes later with a woman in a different uniform who introduced herself as Valerie, the cruise director. She asked me to start from the beginning and tell her everything while she took notes on a tablet. I went through the whole story again, starting with Diane's announcement at our wedding reception. The matching shirts, the impersonation to get our itinerary, the massage incident, all of it. When I finished, Valerie looked at Victor and said this clearly violated their harassment policy, and they needed to discuss what accommodations they could offer us to make the rest of our honeymoon actually enjoyable. They stepped away for a quiet conversation while I sat there hoping they could do something, anything, to give us some space from Diane. Valerie came back and explained that while they couldn't remove Diane from the ship in the middle of the ocean, they could absolutely move us to a completely different deck and program Diane's room key, so it wouldn't give her access to that area. Even better, they had a premium suite available on the exclusive top deck that required special elevator access, and they wanted to upgrade us at no charge as an apology for what we'd been dealing with. The relief hit me so hard I felt tears start and had to blink them back right there in the office. Victor added that they could also arrange separate dining times in the system so Diane couldn't just show up at our table, and they'd make sure she couldn't book any of the remaining excursions we were signed up for. Plus, they were adding notes to her guest file about the harassment issue in case she tried to cause problems with other staff members. I thanked them about 5 times and practically ran back to our cabin where Brett was sitting on the bed pretending to read but obviously just staring at the same page. When I told him about the upgrade and the deck restriction that would actually keep his mother away from us, he jumped up and picked me up and spun me around laughing. We had exactly 2 hours before Diane expected us for the lunch she'd planned without asking us, which gave us just enough time to pack everything and move to our new suite without her knowing until it was done. The steward helped us with our luggage and led us to a different elevator that required him to use a special key card, then up to a deck we hadn't even known existed. Our new suite had floor-to-ceiling windows, a huge private balcony with actual furniture and a table, a separate living room area with a couch and TV, and a bathroom bigger than our apartment bedroom back home with a giant soaking tub. Brett kept walking from room to room saying he couldn't believe this was real, that we were finally going to have our actual honeymoon the way we'd planned it. I felt lighter than I had since the wedding reception, like someone had lifted a weight off my chest that I'd been carrying for weeks. We were unpacking when my phone started going crazy with texts from Diane asking where we were for lunch, saying she was waiting at the restaurant, asking if we'd forgotten about her. Brett looked at the messages and then just turned off both our phones completely. He suggested we order room service, spend the whole afternoon on our private balcony, and deal with his mother later when we were ready. We ate lunch outside watching the ocean, and actually relaxed for the first time in 4 days. Around 5 o'clock, Brett turned his phone back on, and it immediately started buzzing with notifications. 17 missed calls from his mother, and a dozen increasingly frantic text messages. The early ones were annoyed about us missing lunch, then confused about why we weren't answering, then worried something had happened to us. The last message said she'd gone to our old cabin, and the steward told her we'd moved, and now she was demanding to know where we were immediately, and why we would do this to her. Brett read through all of them with his jaw tight, then typed out a short message saying we needed a change and we'd see her tomorrow. Before Diane could respond, he blocked her number completely, and I watched his hands shake slightly as he did it. He looked scared but also determined, and he told me he should have done this years ago, that his father was right to leave because Diane makes absolutely everything about her own needs no matter who it hurts. We got dressed up and went to the adult-only restaurant we'd originally booked for our first night, just the 2 of us with ocean views and candlelight and no interruptions. The waiter who seated us mentioned that he'd served us that first night when the older woman had joined our table, and he seemed genuinely happy to see us alone together this time. After dinner, we walked back through the ship's corridors hand in hand, and the whole way I kept expecting Diane to appear around a corner, but she never did. We got to our new suite and changed into comfortable clothes, then grabbed the thick blankets from the bed and went out to the balcony. The night air was cold but not freezing, and we could see more stars than I'd ever seen in my life. We lay down on the balcony loungers pushed together, wrapped in blankets, listening to the ocean moving below us. Brett pulled me close and we just stared up at the sky for maybe an hour without talking. Around midnight, he whispered that this was exactly what he'd imagined when he proposed to me 2 years ago. Just the 2 of us under the stars with nothing but ocean around us and our whole lives ahead. I realized right then that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to actually relax around him, to not be constantly tense and waiting for Diane to show up and ruin whatever moment we were having. For the first time since the wedding reception, I felt like we were actually married, actually together, actually starting our life instead of just surviving his mother's invasion of it. We woke up the next morning still on the balcony with the sun warming our faces and gulls calling overhead. My phone said it was already 9, later than we'd slept since getting on the ship. We ordered breakfast from room service and ate on the balcony in our pajamas, taking our time with coffee and pastries and fresh fruit. Brett pulled out the port information for today's stop, and we looked through the excursion options without once checking whether Diane had booked any of them. He said we were doing exactly what we wanted, and if she happened to show up, we'd deal with it then, but we weren't letting her control our choices anymore. I agreed, and we picked the glacier kayaking trip, something we'd skipped before because Diane had booked the big group glacier tour bus and we'd been trying to avoid her. The kayaking was scheduled to leave at 11, so we had time to shower and get ready without rushing. We got off the ship at the port and found the meeting point for the kayaking company. The guide was a woman in her 30s with a huge smile who introduced herself and started checking people in. Our group was only 12 people total, all adults, everyone quiet and excited. The guide explained we'd be kayaking among smaller ice chunks near the glacier face, might see seals and possibly whales, and the water was calm today, so it would be perfect conditions. We loaded into a small bus that took us 20 minutes up the coast to a protected bay. I kept watching for Diane the whole time, but there was no sign of her anywhere. The guide helped us into dry suits and life jackets, gave us a quick paddling lesson on land, then we carried the kayaks down to the water. Brett and I got a tandem kayak and pushed off into the bay. The water was so clear and blue it almost didn't look real. We paddled out toward the glacier face, and the guide led us around chunks of ice floating in the water, some small as basketballs and others big as cars. The ice was this incredible bright blue color in some places where it had broken fresh from the glacier. We saw seals sunbathing on the bigger chunks, and they barely looked at us as we paddled past. Halfway through the tour, Brett stopped paddling completely, and I turned around to see what was wrong. He was just staring at me with this amazed expression on his face, smiling bigger than I'd seen him smile in weeks. He said he'd completely forgotten I had this adventurous side, that we'd been in survival mode dealing with his mother for so long that he'd forgotten why he fell in love with me in the first place. He said watching me paddle through glacier water with seals nearby and ice chunks all around reminded him of our third date when I'd convinced him to go rock climbing even though he was scared of heights. I remembered that date and how proud he'd been when he made it to the top. I told him we'd get through this whole Diane situation and find our way back to being us, and he nodded and we kept paddling. We got back to the ship around 4 p.m, tired and happy and glowing from the cold and the exercise. We walked through the main atrium heading for the elevators, and I spotted Diane immediately. She was sitting in one of the big chairs near the central staircase, clearly positioned to watch people coming and going. Her eyes locked on us and she started to stand up. Before I could react or tense up, Brett grabbed my hand and steered us smoothly toward the elevator bank, nodding politely at his mother but not slowing down or stopping. She called his name, then called it louder, but he just kept walking. We reached the elevators and he pressed the button. I could hear Diane's footsteps behind us getting closer and faster. The elevator arrived and the doors opened. We stepped inside and Diane rushed up trying to get in with us. Brett held up his hand like a stop signal and said we'd talk later, Mom, then pressed the door close button. The doors slid shut on Diane's shocked face, her mouth open mid-sentence. In the elevator, Brett started shaking slightly, his hands trembling as he pressed the button for our deck. I squeezed his hand and didn't say anything, just stood close to him while he took deep breaths. The elevator ride felt very long, even though it was only maybe 30 seconds. When we got to our floor, we walked quickly to our suite and got inside, and Brett sat down on the couch and put his head in his hands. After a minute, he looked up at me and admitted he'd never directly refused his mother anything before in his entire life. He said he'd always just avoided her or made excuses or found ways around her demands, but he'd never actually told her no and meant it. He said watching me go to guest services yesterday and actually solve the problem instead of just enduring it had shown him that problems could be fixed, that we didn't have to just suffer through whatever his mother decided to do to us. I sat next to him and told him I was proud of him for setting that boundary, and he leaned against me looking exhausted, but also a little bit proud of himself. We'd been in the suite for maybe an hour, just relaxing and talking about the kayaking trip, when someone started pounding on our door. Diane's voice came through loud and demanding, saying she knew we were in there and we needed to let her in immediately. Brett looked at me and I shook my head. We got up and walked out to our balcony, closing the sliding door behind us. We could still hear her pounding and calling for us, but we just sat down in the balcony chairs and looked at the ocean. The pounding continued for several minutes, then stopped. We heard her voice in the hallway getting louder, clearly talking to someone, maybe another passenger or a crew member. Then her footsteps, angry and hard, walking away down the hall. We stayed on the balcony another 20 minutes just to be sure she was really gone. That evening we got dressed up and went to the specialty sushi restaurant we'd heard was amazing. We were seated at a small table by the window with ocean views, and we'd just ordered when Valerie, the cruise director, walked past our table. She stopped and smiled, asking how we were enjoying the new suite. We thanked her enthusiastically and said it had completely changed our trip. She nodded and then mentioned quietly that Diane had come to guest services earlier that day demanding our new room number. Valerie said they'd refused to provide it per their privacy policy, explaining that all guest room locations are confidential information. She said the staff member had been very professional about it, but Diane hadn't taken it well. Valerie leaned in a bit closer and added that Diane had made quite a scene in the guest services office. She'd threatened to leave bad reviews everywhere, claimed we'd stolen her vacation by excluding her, and insisted that as Brett's mother, she had a right to know where he was staying. Valerie said the security chief, Marco Sanchez, had to come escort Diane out of the office when she refused to leave and started raising her voice at the staff. They'd flagged her in the system as a potential problem guest, and all crew members had been notified to be aware of the situation. Valerie apologized that we were dealing with this on our honeymoon, said the crew was doing everything they could to help, and told us to contact her directly if we needed anything else. Then she smiled and left us to our dinner. The next morning, we woke up early for our whale watching trip. A different company than the disaster with Diane throwing up everywhere. We got to the dock and the boat was way smaller, maybe 20 people max, and everyone seemed calm and respectful. The guide explained we were going to a different area where a pod of orcas had been spotted the day before. Brett held my hand as we pulled away from shore, and I could see him actually relaxing for the first time in days. About an hour into the trip, the guide suddenly cut the engine and pointed off the starboard side. There they were, a whole pod of orcas surfacing and diving, so close I could hear them breathing when they came up for air. The sound was incredible, this powerful whoosh that echoed across the water. Everyone on the boat stayed quiet, just watching and taking photos, and I felt Brett squeeze my hand tighter. We stayed with the pod for almost 30 minutes, watching them hunt and play, and when we finally headed back to shore, Brett looked at me and smiled bigger than he had since before the wedding. That evening, we got dressed up for dinner at the main dining room, something we'd been avoiding because Diane always managed to find us there. The hostess seated us at a small table for two in the back corner with a view of the ocean, and we'd just ordered drinks when I saw Diane walking toward us. She had that determined look on her face and was already pulling out the chair at our table before she even reached us. The waiter appeared instantly and told her very politely that this was a reserved table for two, and he'd be happy to seat her elsewhere in the restaurant. Diane's face went red and she started to argue, but the waiter just smiled and gestured toward the hostess stand. I realized guest services must have flagged all our dining reservations to protect us from exactly this situation. Diane stood there for what felt like forever, clearly trying to decide if she should make a scene in front of the whole restaurant. Finally, she forced this tight smile and said she'd just eat in her cabin tonight since her own son was apparently too busy for her. Brett didn't even flinch, just said goodnight, Mom, in this calm voice, and she walked away with her back all stiff and angry. After dinner, we decided to walk around the deck and get some fresh air before heading back to our suite. We were near the pool area when I heard Diane's voice coming from somewhere behind us, talking loud to another passenger about ungrateful children who abandon their mothers. Brett stopped walking and I felt his whole body tense up next to me. For a second, I thought he might turn around and confront her, but then he deliberately turned the opposite direction and took my hand. We walked to the other side of the deck and found a quiet spot to watch the sunset, the sky turning orange and pink over the water. Day 7 started with us getting ready for the helicopter tour, the excursion we'd been most excited about since we booked this trip. Brett was in the bathroom when his phone rang from a number he didn't recognize. He answered it and I heard his voice change immediately, going from happy to worried. It was Diane calling from the ship's phone system. She was crying hard, saying she was sick and needed him to come check on her right away. Brett asked what was wrong specifically, but she just kept saying she felt terrible and needed her son, and what if something serious was wrong? I watched Brett's face and could see him starting to waver between guilt and suspicion about whether she was really sick. I took the phone from him and told Diane we'd stop by the medical center on our way out and have them send someone to check on her. She immediately said that wasn't necessary. She just needed Brett, not some stranger doctor. That confirmed everything I needed to know about whether this was real or just another manipulation to make us miss our excursion. Brett took the phone back and told his mother the medical staff were way better equipped to help if she was genuinely ill, and if she refused their help, then she must not be that sick. He hung up while she was still talking, protests coming through the speaker, then sat down heavily on the bed and put his head in his hands. I sat next to him and he said he knew she was manipulating him, but the guilt still felt overwhelming, like this crushing weight on his chest. He said she raised him to believe her needs always came first, that a good son drops everything when his mother calls. I reminded him that real emergencies don't magically disappear when you offer professional medical help, and he nodded slowly like he was trying to convince himself. We made it to the helicopter tour on time, and it was absolutely incredible, flying over these massive blue glaciers that stretched forever. The pilot landed us on ancient ice, and we got out to walk around and take photos and even drink water straight from a glacier stream. Brett seemed completely different afterward, lighter somehow, like he'd proven to himself that he could choose us over his mother's manipulation tactics. On the flight back to the ship, he kept looking at me with this amazed expression, and I knew something had shifted in him, that he'd crossed some kind of line he couldn't uncross. That evening, we headed to the main atrium for a drink and spotted Diane immediately. She was standing near the grand staircase talking animatedly with a group of older passengers, gesturing with her hands and laughing too loudly. The second she saw us across the space, she stopped mid-sentence and turned her back dramatically, shoulders stiff. I watched her lean closer to the woman next to her and heard fragments of her voice carrying across the open area. My son has changed. So much since he got married, she was saying. He used to be so thoughtful and caring. Brett heard it too because his jaw tightened and he started walking directly toward her. I followed quickly, surprised because he'd been avoiding confrontation with her all week. He stopped right next to Diane's little audience and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear clearly. Mom, I'm so glad you're feeling better. You looked pretty healthy dancing around up there considering you were too sick to see the ship's doctor this morning. Diane's face went bright red, and her mouth opened and closed without sound. The passengers she'd been talking to looked confused and uncomfortable. She made a strangled noise and said something about needing to get back to her cabin, then practically ran toward the elevators without looking at any of us. One of the women Diane had been chatting with caught my eye as we walked past and gave me a small thumbs up with a knowing smile. The gesture hit me harder than I expected because it meant other people had noticed how inappropriate she'd been all week. I wasn't imagining it, or being too sensitive like Diane kept implying. There were witnesses to her behavior, and at least some of them understood what we were dealing with. Brett took my hand and we went to the quiet bar on deck 12, ordered wine, and sat watching the dark ocean for an hour without talking much. He seemed lighter somehow, like confronting his mother publicly had lifted something heavy off his shoulders. Day 8. We never left our suite and balcony. We ordered room service for breakfast and lunch, watched 3 movies on the cabin TV, and spent hours just lying on the balcony loungers talking about nothing important. No Diane sightings, no knocking on our door, no dramatic texts about being abandoned. Just us being actual newlyweds on our honeymoon like we'd originally planned. Brett kept saying he couldn't believe we had this whole beautiful suite to ourselves and nobody was going to interrupt us. We napped in the afternoon with the balcony door open and ocean sounds drifting in. Ordered fancy steaks for dinner and ate them outside watching the sunset turn the water orange and pink. It felt like a completely different trip than the first 3 days had been, like we'd finally escaped onto the vacation we'd saved 2 years for. Day 9, we were walking the promenade deck after breakfast when the ship's photographer stopped us near the photo gallery. He recognized us and said he had some pictures from embarkation day if we wanted to look at them. When he pulled them up on his computer screen, I saw exactly what he meant. There was Diane in that awful matching shirt standing between us with her arms around both our shoulders, grinning like she'd won something. Brett and I both looked miserable with frozen smiles that didn't reach our eyes. The photographer asked if we wanted copies for our album, and Brett actually started laughing. He said absolutely not. Those pictures captured the worst day of our honeymoon. The photographer looked confused, so Brett explained briefly that his mother had crashed our trip, and those photos were from before we figured out how to handle it. The guy's eyes went wide, and he deleted the photos right there in front of us without us even asking. Our last port stop was Juneau, and we made a spontaneous decision that morning. We went to the excursion desk and asked what was still available for the day, something Diane definitely wouldn't have booked. They had spots open on a dog sledding tour that included a helicopter ride to a glacier camp. We booked it on the spot and felt almost giddy with the spontaneity of it, like we were being rebellious teenagers instead of responsible adults. The tour was incredible. We flew over mountains and glaciers in a small helicopter, landed at a mushing camp on ancient ice, and spent 3 hours playing with dozens of sled dogs. The mushers let us help harness teams, and then we each drove our own sled across the glacier with a guide. The dogs were so excited and strong, pulling hard and fast across the white expanse. Brett kept looking back at me from his sled ahead with this huge, genuine smile I hadn't seen since before the wedding. We took 100 photos with the puppies afterward, all fluffy and playful and climbing all over us. Flying back to the ship, I felt completely free and happy, like we'd finally gotten our honeymoon back entirely. That night was our last dinner on the ship, and we had reservations at the fancy steakhouse Diane had hijacked our very first night. This time, it was just us at a corner table with candlelight and wine and the meal we'd originally planned before she'd inserted herself. The waiter recognized us and seemed genuinely pleased to see us alone, making a point of saying he hoped we'd enjoyed our honeymoon. Brett ordered champagne and made a toast to our actual honeymoon finally happening, to us figuring out how to be a team, to setting boundaries and sticking to them. We lingered over dessert and coffee, not wanting the evening to end because tomorrow we'd be back in Seattle dealing with real life and Diane again. When we finally left the restaurant after 10 o'clock, Diane was standing in the corridor outside like she'd been waiting. She blocked our path with her arms crossed and demanded to know why we'd been avoiding her all week. Brett didn't get defensive or apologetic. He just said very calmly that we're on our honeymoon, Mom. We wanted time alone as a married couple, and that's normal and healthy. Diane's eyes immediately filled with tears, and her voice went high and shaky. She started talking about how lonely she'd been, how she just wanted to share this beautiful experience with us, how she didn't understand why we were being so cruel. Brett stayed completely firm and said she can be lonely at home just as easily. She chose to intrude on our honeymoon, and the consequences of that choice are hers to deal with. I watched Diane's face change as she realized the crying wasn't working. She switched tactics instantly, her tears stopping and her voice going hard and angry. She said I'd turned him against her, that he never acted this way before he met me, that I'd poisoned her son against his own mother. Brett actually laughed out loud at that and said, "No, Mom. I just avoided you before. Amy taught me I can actually set boundaries instead." We walked away while she was still sputtering, and I heard her voice getting louder behind us, but Brett didn't look back. In the elevator, he stayed quiet for 3 floors, just staring at the numbers lighting up one by one. His hands were shaking a little, and he kept taking these deep breaths like he was trying to calm himself down. Then he looked at me and said that felt terrible and necessary at the same time, like he thinks maybe he's finally growing up or something. I squeezed his hand and we rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a good silence, the kind where you don't need to fill it with words. Back in our suite, we ordered room service and sat on the balcony watching the stars, And Brett kept saying he couldn't believe he actually walked away from her mid-sentence, that his whole life he'd stood there and taken it until she was done talking. Our last night on the ship, we packed slowly, folding clothes and tucking away souvenirs from the excursions we'd actually enjoyed without Diane hovering. Brett brought up how we'd handle his mother when we got home, and I could tell he'd been thinking about it for a while. He said he needs to have a serious conversation with his father about how they both enabled her behavior for years, how his dad just divorced her and escaped, but Brett has to find a way to maintain boundaries while staying in contact. I suggested maybe his father could teach him some strategies since he'd dealt with Diane longer than anyone, and Brett nodded like that made sense. We stayed up late talking through different scenarios, planning responses to her guilt trips and surprise visits, making rules we could both agree on. The next morning at disembarkation, we got in line with our luggage, and there was Diane at the gangway, clearly planning to share our shuttle and flight home. She had her bags arranged next to where the transport line formed and kept watching for us with this expectant smile. Brett saw her, took a breath, and walked straight past her to the cruise line desk instead of getting in the shuttle line. I followed him and heard Diane calling his name behind us, but he kept walking. At the desk, he asked about changing our flights, explaining we wanted to spend the day in Seattle before heading home, and the agent clicked through her computer and said they could accommodate us with seats on an evening flight instead. Diane caught up to us right as the agent was printing our new boarding passes, and she demanded to know what we were doing, why we were changing plans without telling her. Brett turned to her and said very calmly that we're spending the day in Seattle and taking a later flight, just the two of us. She immediately said she'd join us, that she'd love to see Seattle, that she could change her flight too. Brett said, "No, Mom, we're having one more day of our honeymoon alone," and then he just walked away while she stood there sputtering. We spent a beautiful day exploring Pike Place Market with all the fish throwing and flower stalls and street musicians playing for crowds. The food was amazing, fresh salmon and clam chowder and these little donut things that were still warm. We walked along the waterfront holding hands and taking pictures, and Brett kept checking his phone nervously like he expected Diane to call any minute. But she didn't call, and after a few hours he finally relaxed and stopped looking at his phone every 5 minutes. Just enjoyed our last day together. We found this little bookstore and spent an hour browsing, bought a cookbook of Pacific Northwest recipes to try at home. On the flight home that evening, we had our own row with no Diane squeezed between us for once. Brett held my hand during takeoff and said this week taught him more about being married than the wedding did, that marriage means choosing your spouse over everyone else, including your mother. He said watching me handle everything, from going to guest services to staying calm during Diane's tantrums, showed him what a real partnership looks like. We landed late around 10 at night and took a cab home to our apartment, both of us exhausted but happy. In the cab, I checked my phone and there were 17 texts from Diane sent throughout the day. Most were guilt trips about how we abandoned her, how she had to spend the day alone in the airport, how she couldn't believe her own son would treat her this way. But the last text just said we need to talk when we're ready, which felt slightly less manipulative than the others. The next morning, Brett called his father and they talked for over an hour while I made breakfast and pretended not to listen. I could hear Brett's side of the conversation, how his voice got frustrated, then sad, then determined. His father apologized for not preparing Brett better for dealing with Diane's behavior, admitted he escaped through divorce, but Brett has to find a way to maintain boundaries while staying in contact, since cutting her off completely isn't what Brett wants. They talked through specific situations and how to handle them, what to say when she guilt trips or shows up unannounced or tries to insert herself into plans. Brett's father mentioned that Charlotte, his new wife, had to deal with Diane's harassment early in their relationship, and eventually just blocked her completely after months of nasty calls and surprise visits. He offered to have Charlotte talk to both of us about strategies that worked for them, and Brett said yes immediately, that he wants to learn from people who've successfully dealt with his mother. After he hung up, Brett looked lighter somehow, like talking to his father had lifted some weight he'd been carrying. 2 days after returning home, I was making lunch when someone knocked on our apartment door. Brett answered it, and I heard Diane's voice in the hallway, loud and insistent. He didn't invite her in, just stood in the doorway blocking her view of our place. I moved closer so I could hear, and Diane was saying she just wanted to see him, that she'd been so worried, that it's not right for a mother to have to make an appointment to see her own son. Brett stayed calm and explained that surprise visits aren't acceptable anymore, that she needs to call first and respect when we say we're not available. Diane started crying and saying he'd changed, that I'd turned him against her, all the usual stuff. But Brett didn't budge, just repeated that these are the new rules, and she can either follow them or not see us as much. I heard her walk away still crying, and Brett closed the door and leaned against it, looking tired but proud of himself. That night we talked about what comes next, and Brett said he needs to actually tell his mother what the rules are, instead of just avoiding her. The next afternoon, Diane called crying and apologizing, saying she understands she went too far on the cruise and she just missed him so much after the wedding. Brett put her on speaker and told her he appreciates the apology, but things need to change going forward. She needs to call before visiting, respect when we say no to plans, and understand that we need time alone as a married couple. Diane sniffled and agreed to whatever he wanted, said she never meant to intrude and just got carried away with excitement. After he hung up, I asked if he believed her, and he said probably not completely. But at least now the expectations are clear. Over the next week, we sat at our kitchen table and wrote out actual boundaries with specific examples. Scheduled phone calls twice a week on Tuesday and Saturday evenings. At least 3 days advance notice for any visits to our apartment. No surprise appearances at our work, our friends' events, or anywhere else without explicit invitation. No guilt trips or manipulation when we say no to plans. Brett typed it all into an email and read it out loud twice before sending it, his finger hovering over the button for a solid minute. Diane's response came 2 hours later. A long message about how formal and cold everything feels now and how she raised him to be warmer than this. But at the end, she wrote she would follow the rules because she loves him and wants to be part of his life. Brett said the hurt tone was typical Diane, but the actual agreement was more than he expected. 3 weeks after the honeymoon, we had our first scheduled dinner with Diane at a chain restaurant halfway between our apartment and her house. She arrived exactly on time wearing a nice dress and makeup, hugged us both carefully, and asked polite questions about our trip. She wanted to know about the glaciers and the wildlife and the food, and when Brett mentioned the helicopter tour, her face tightened, but she just said that sounded amazing. The dinner lasted almost exactly 2 hours, and when we said we needed to head home, she gathered her purse immediately and walked us to our car. She didn't try to extend the evening or suggest coming back to our place or make plans for next time. In the car afterward, Brett admitted he kept waiting for her to boundary stomp, to push for more time or invite herself over or guilt trip us about something. I pointed out that she did make a few passive-aggressive comments about how formal everything is now and how she barely sees us anymore. Brett hadn't even caught those moments, which showed how much her manipulation usually worked on him. I reminded him that some pushback is normal when you start enforcing boundaries with people who never had to respect them before, that Diane spent 30 years training him to give in. A month after the cruise, we finally felt ready to go through our honeymoon photos, hundreds of them on our phones and the ship photographer's website. The first 3 days told an awful story. Us looking tense and miserable in every shot with Diane photobombing constantly or inserting herself between us. Her arm around Brett, her hand on my shoulder, her face in every frame. Then suddenly around day 4, the photos shifted completely, showing us actually happy and relaxed and in love on our balcony and at excursions and during dinners. We looked like different people, like an actual married couple on their honeymoon instead of hostages. Brett stared at the contrast for a long time, then said he wants to remember that we solved the problem instead of just suffering through it. We created an album with only the good photos, the ones from after we moved suites and reclaimed our trip. Every picture showed us genuinely smiling, holding hands, kissing with ocean views behind us. Brett said these photos prove we have power in our marriage, that we can identify problems and fix them together instead of just enduring bad situations. One evening, about 6 weeks after the cruise, Diane called during our scheduled Tuesday time and asked if we would come to dinner at her place the following week. Brett looked at me first, waiting for my response before answering his mother. I nodded and he told her yes, but we would need to leave by 8 because we have plans the next morning, establishing a clear time boundary right up front. Diane agreed quickly, too quickly, and I knew she would test that limit when the time came. The dinner at Diane's house was awkward but manageable. Her dining room table set formally with cloth napkins and her good dishes. She served pot roast and asked more polite questions about our jobs and our apartment and our plans for the holidays. But she also made comments about how she never sees us anymore and how marriage changes people and how she remembers when Brett used to call her every day. Brett redirected each time, acknowledging her feelings without apologizing or changing our boundaries. At 7:55, we stood up and gathered our things despite Diane saying she made dessert and it would only take a minute to serve. Brett thanked her for dinner and said we would see her next scheduled visit, and we left exactly at 8 while she stood in her doorway looking disappointed. In the car afterward, Brett said maintaining boundaries with her is exhausting, but so much better than the alternative of letting her control everything. I agreed and added that she is slowly learning we are serious even if she tests the limits constantly, that every time we enforce a boundary it gets slightly easier. 2 months after the honeymoon, Brett's father invited us for dinner at his house to meet Charlotte properly, and we spent the evening swapping stories about managing Diane. Charlotte shared that it took almost a year of consistent boundary enforcement before Diane stopped trying to manipulate her way back into their lives constantly, that the first 6 months involved weekly surprise visits and guilt trip phone calls and showing up at their work. She said the key was never giving in even once because Diane would see any weakness as proof the boundaries were negotiable. Brett looked discouraged hearing it would take so long, but Charlotte reminded him that we had already made more progress in 2 months than she expected, that having united boundaries from the start made everything easier. Brett's father apologized again for not teaching Brett these skills earlier, for handling Diane through avoidance instead of direct confrontation. He said watching Brett stand up to his mother made him proud, that it took real strength to set boundaries with someone who raised you to never say no to her. A few weeks later, Brett and I sat on our couch looking at cabin rentals for our 3-month anniversary weekend, scrolling through options in the mountains about 2 hours away. Brett closed his laptop suddenly and suggested we just book it, and not tell his mother until we got back. That way we could actually relax without her trying to insert herself into our plans. I reminded him that keeping secrets from Diane usually made things worse when she found out, that she would use it as proof we were excluding her on purpose and turn herself into the victim. Brett nodded slowly and agreed we should tell her, but make it completely clear she was not invited, and we would not be answering our phones during the trip, establishing the boundaries up front, instead of hoping she would respect unspoken ones. He called her that evening and mentioned casually that we had booked a weekend cabin getaway for our 3-month anniversary, keeping his tone light and factual. Diane immediately started suggesting hiking trails we should check out, and restaurants in the area she had heard were good, offering to send us a whole list of activities and help us plan our itinerary. Brett thanked her for the suggestions but said we had already made our plans and were looking forward to a quiet weekend, then smoothly changed the subject to ask about her book club before she could push further. She tried twice more to circle back to our trip with more suggestions, but Brett redirected each time without getting frustrated or defensive, just calmly moving the conversation elsewhere. When he hung up, he looked exhausted but satisfied, telling me that 6 months ago he would have either accepted her help to avoid conflict or gotten angry and started a fight. But now he could just hold the boundary without drama. The weekend itself turned out perfect and completely drama-free, just us hiking through fall leaves and sitting by the fire and sleeping late without any interruptions. We kept our phones off most of the time, checking messages only once each evening, and Diane had sent exactly one text Saturday afternoon asking if we were having fun. No guilt trips, no multiple messages demanding responses, no attempts to call repeatedly, just a simple question that felt shockingly normal. Brett stared at his phone for a long moment before responding with a brief yes and a photo of the cabin, maintaining contact without over-engaging or opening the door to a lengthy text conversation. When we got home Sunday night, he showed me her response, which was just a smiley face and a comment that the cabin looked nice, and I could see him processing that maybe the boundaries were actually working. 3 months after our crashed honeymoon, Brett and I had become stronger as a couple than I imagined possible back on that ship, when Diane was ruining everything. We learned we could solve problems together instead of just suffering through them, that boundaries were not mean or selfish but necessary even with family, and that our marriage had to come first before anyone else's feelings or demands. Diane was still Diane, still testing limits and making passive-aggressive comments about how we never had time for her anymore and how marriage changed Brett. But we had built a system that actually worked for us. She got scheduled time with us twice a week through calls and occasional dinners, surface-level involvement in our lives where she could feel was included without controlling everything, and we got peace and privacy and an actual marriage where we made decisions together. It was not perfect, and probably never would be, because Diane would always push boundaries and try to manipulate situations to center herself. But we were happy and united, and that was what mattered most. Our honeymoon taught us we were on the same team, fighting the same battle, and that foundation was what everything else got built on, the knowledge that we would choose each other over everyone else, including his mother.